Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here with some absolutely wild stories from the depths of Reddit that'll either help you drift off or keep you wide awake, wondering how people can actually behave like this. Whether you're winding down after a long day, dealing with insomnia, or just need some background noise while you're building that perfect castle in Minecraft, you're in the right place. I've got a collection of stories tonight that range from family drama to workplace chaos to relationships gone completely sideways. These are the kind of posts that make you grateful for your own relatively normal problems. So grab your favourite blanket, get comfortable, and let's dive into some tales that prove reality is often stranger than fiction. Our first story comes from someone who thought wedding planning was stressful enough without family interference. Boy, was she wrong. My fiance's mum tried to wear a wedding dress to my ceremony. I'm 28 years old, and I got married 3 months ago to the love of my life, Tom. The whole engagement period was pretty smooth sailing until about 2 weeks before the wedding, when my future mother-in-law, Patricia, started acting strange. Patricia had always been a bit dramatic, the type of person who needs to be the centre of attention at every gathering. But I figured she'd tone it down for her son's wedding day. I was so wrong it's not even funny. The first red flag should have been when she asked to see my wedding dress. She claimed she wanted to make sure her outfit wouldn't clash, which seemed reasonable at the time. I showed her photos and she made all the appropriate comments about how beautiful it was, how perfect it would be for the ceremony. 2 days before the wedding, my maid of honour called me in a panic. She'd been at the bridal shop picking up her altered dress when she overheard Patricia talking to one of the employees. Patricia was asking about rush alterations on what the employee described as a white lace gown with a train. I convinced myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe Patricia was helping another family member with a dress, or maybe she was looking at something for a different event. There was no way she'd actually try to wear white to my wedding, let alone something that sounded like an actual wedding dress. The morning of the ceremony, I was getting ready with my bridesmaids when my cousin burst into the bridal suite. She looked pale and was clearly trying not to upset me, but she said I needed to know that Patricia had just arrived at the church, wearing what could only be described as a wedding dress. I asked my maid of honour to go check it out, while I tried to stay calm and finish getting ready. She came back 10 minutes later and confirmed my worst fears. Patricia was wearing a floor-length white lace dress, with off-the-shoulder sleeves and a small train. It wasn't exactly like mine, but it was unmistakably bridal. When confronted by my maid of honour, Patricia had the audacity to say she wanted to match the bride and that she thought it would make for better photos if we coordinated. She claimed she'd put a lot of thought into it and was surprised anyone would have a problem with her choice. My fiancé was horrified when he found out. He immediately went to talk to his mother, but she refused to change. She said she'd spent too much money on the dress and that everyone was overreacting. She kept insisting that she looked appropriate for the mother of the groom and that I was being bridezilla about the whole thing. The ceremony started late because we spent 20 minutes trying to convince Patricia to at least put on the navy blue dress she'd brought as a backup. She eventually agreed, but spent the entire time complaining loudly about how she was being treated unfairly and how no one appreciated her efforts to make the day special. The reception was even worse. Patricia made sure to position herself in every photo opportunity, often standing directly next to me in her white dress. She told anyone who would listen that she'd chosen her outfit to complement mine and couldn't understand why everyone was being so negative about her fashion choice. During the mother-son dance, she made comments to the photographer about how nice it was that both the bride and mother of the groom had chosen white for the occasion. She seemed genuinely convinced that she'd made an appropriate choice and that everyone else was just being difficult. The worst part was watching Tom try to manage the situation while still enjoying his wedding day. He spent more time apologising for his mother's behaviour than celebrating our marriage. Several guests approached me throughout the night to express their shock at Patricia's outfit choice and to offer their support. Looking back at our wedding photos now, I can see Patricia in her white lace dress, hovering in the background of almost every shot. What should have been beautiful memories of our special day are forever marked by her need to be the centre of attention. Tom and I have been married for 3 months now, and Patricia still doesn't understand why everyone was so upset about her dress choice. She's brought it up several times, always framing herself as the victim who was just trying to be involved in her son's wedding. She's even suggested that maybe I was jealous of how good she looked. The whole experience taught me a lot about setting boundaries with in-laws, but it also made me realise that some people will go to incredible lengths to make someone else's special day about themselves. I just never expected it to happen at my own wedding. That story is over. The sheer delusion it takes to show up to your son's wedding in a white lace gown and then act surprised when people are upset is truly mind-boggling. Some people really will make any occasion about themselves, even when it means sabotaging their own child's happiness. The fact that she still doesn't understand what she did wrong makes it even worse. Speaking of family members who cross major boundaries, this next story involves a brother who decided to solve his financial problems by stealing from someone who trusted him. My brother sold my gaming PC while I was at work. I'm 24 years old and work full-time as a software developer. About 6 months ago, I decided to treat myself to a really nice gaming setup after saving up for over a year. We're talking top-of-the-line graphics card, custom cooling system, RGB everything, the works. It cost me nearly $4,000, but it was my dream computer, and I was so proud of it. My younger brother Chris is 21 and has been going through a rough patch lately. He dropped out of college last year and has been struggling to find steady work. He's been living with our parents, but they've been putting pressure on him to get his life together, which has caused a lot of tension in the house. About 2 months ago, Chris asked if he could stay at my apartment for a few days while things cooled down at home. He seemed genuinely upset about his situation, and I felt bad for him. We've always been close, and I figured a change of scenery might help him figure things out. Those few days turned into a few weeks, which turned into him basically moving in. I didn't mind too much because he was helping with groceries and seemed to be actively looking for work. He spent a lot of time on my computer, applying for jobs and playing games when he needed to de-stress. Last Tuesday, I came home from work expecting to spend the evening gaming with some friends online. We'd planned a raid that I'd been looking forward to all week, but when I walked into my apartment, the space where my computer had been was completely empty. At first, I thought maybe Chris had moved it for some reason, or maybe we'd been robbed. I called out for him, but there was no answer. His stuff was still there, so I knew he hadn't left permanently. I started checking every room, thinking maybe he'd moved the computer to clean or something. I found a note on my kitchen counter, written in Chris's handwriting. It was short and to the point, saying that he'd sold my computer because he needed money more than I needed it. He claimed that since I worked all day, I barely used it anyway, and that his financial situation was more urgent than my gaming hobby. The note also mentioned that he'd gotten a good price for it, and that he'd pay me back as soon as he got on his feet. He said I'd understand once I thought about it rationally, and that family should help each other out during tough times. I called him immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left multiple messages demanding to know where my computer was and how he could possibly think this was okay. I was furious, not just about losing the computer, but about the complete betrayal of trust. Chris finally called me back 3 hours later. He sounded defensive from the moment he answered the phone. He insisted that he'd done nothing wrong and that I was being selfish for caring more about a computer than my own brother's well-being. When I pressed him for details about where he'd sold it, he got evasive. He claimed he'd found a buyer online, but couldn't remember their name or contact information. He said he'd gotten $2,000 for it, which was less than half what I'd paid, and that the money was already spent on rent for a new apartment and other necessities. I asked him how he planned to pay me back if he'd already spent all the money, and he said he'd figure it out once he found a job. He kept emphasizing that I made good money and could easily buy another computer while he was struggling just to survive. The conversation escalated quickly. Chris accused me of being materialistic and not caring about family. He said our parents had always favoured me and that I'd never had to struggle the way he had. He claimed that selling the computer was just evening the playing field. I told him he had 24 hours to get my computer back, or I'd be filing a police report for theft. He laughed and said I wouldn't actually call the cops on my own brother, that I was just trying to scare him into feeling guilty. When Chris didn't return my computer by the deadline, I did exactly what I'd promised. I filed a theft report with the police and provided them with the note he'd left and recordings of our phone conversations. The officer I spoke with said cases like this were unfortunately common and that family relationships often complicated the legal process. It took 3 weeks, but the police eventually tracked down where Chris had sold my computer. He'd taken it to a pawn shop across town and had only gotten $800 for it, not the $2,000 he'd claimed. The pawn shop owner was cooperative and helped facilitate getting my computer back. Chris was arrested and charged with theft. Our parents were devastated when they found out what had happened. They tried to convince me to drop the charges, saying that Chris had learned his lesson and that involving the legal system would only make things worse for him. But I couldn't just let it go. Chris had violated my trust in the worst possible way, stolen something that meant a lot to me, and then lied about it repeatedly. Even after being caught, he never apologised or showed any genuine remorse for what he'd done. The legal process is still ongoing, but I got my computer back mostly intact. Chris hasn't spoken to me since his arrest, and our relationship may never recover. Some family members think I overreacted by calling the police, while others support my decision to hold him accountable. Looking back, I realise there were probably warning signs that Chris was capable of something like this. His sense of entitlement, his tendency to blame others for his problems, his belief that the world owed him something, but I never imagined he'd steal from me. That story is over. The fact that he tried to justify stealing a $4,000 computer by saying he needed the money more is absolutely wild. Then lying about how much he sold it for and acting like the victim when consequences arrived. Some people really think being family gives them a free pass to commit crimes. At least the legal system disagreed. Our next tale comes from someone whose engagement party turned into a complete disaster, thanks to a friend who couldn't keep his feelings to himself. My best friend tried to kiss me at my engagement party. I'm 26 years old and just got engaged to my boyfriend of 3 years, Alex. We decided to throw an engagement party at my parents' house to celebrate with all our friends and family. It was supposed to be a perfect evening, and for most of the night, it was. My best friend Ryan has been in my life since college. We met during freshman orientation and have been inseparable ever since. He's the kind of friend who remembers your favourite coffee order, shows up when you need help moving, and has been my +1 to countless events over the years. Ryan was one of the first people I called when Alex proposed. He seemed genuinely happy for me and immediately offered to help plan the engagement party. He spent weeks helping me coordinate everything from the catering to the decorations, and I was so grateful to have his support during such an exciting time. The party was in full swing when things went sideways. Alex was mingling with his college buddies near the bar, and I was catching up with some friends from work when Ryan approached me. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him, and asked if we could talk privately. I followed him to the back porch, thinking maybe he needed help with something party-related or wanted to give me a gift he'd been hiding. The last thing I expected was for him to grab my hands and tell me he needed to be honest about something before it was too late. Ryan looked me directly in the eyes and said he'd been in love with me since our sophomore year of college. He said he'd kept quiet because he thought he'd missed his chance, but seeing me get engaged had made him realise he couldn't live with the regret of never telling me how he felt. Before I could even process what he was saying, Ryan leaned in and tried to kiss me. I pulled back immediately and asked him what he thought he was doing. He said he knew it was crazy, but he had to know if there was any chance I felt the same way about him. I was completely stunned. Ryan had never given me any indication that he saw me as more than a friend. We talked about our relationships, our dating struggles, our hopes for the future, and he'd never once hinted at having romantic feelings for me. The timing couldn't have been worse. My engagement party was happening 20 feet away, My fiancé was inside celebrating with our friends and family, and my best friend was confessing his love and trying to kiss me on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. I told Ryan that I cared about him deeply as a friend, but that I'd never thought of him romantically. I explained that I was marrying Alex because I loved him and wanted to spend my life with him, and that Ryan's confession wasn't going to change that. Ryan became emotional and said he understood, but that he couldn't pretend to be happy about my engagement anymore. He said it was torture watching me with Alex, and that he'd been hoping against hope that I'd realise we belonged together before it was too late. The conversation was interrupted when Alex came looking for me. He could immediately tell something was wrong from the tension on the porch and the fact that both Ryan and I looked upset. Alex asked what was going on, and I found myself in the impossible position of having to explain the situation. Ryan, to his credit, was honest about what had happened. He told Alex that he'd confessed his feelings and tried to kiss me, but that I'd rejected him. He apologised for the timing and said he knew he'd probably ruined our friendship, but that he couldn't keep pretending anymore. Alex handled it better than I expected. He was clearly upset and uncomfortable, but he didn't cause a scene or ask Ryan to leave immediately. Instead, he suggested that maybe Ryan should go home and that we could all talk about this later when emotions weren't running so high. But Ryan wasn't ready to leave quietly. He said he wanted to clear the air completely and suggested that maybe I should think carefully about whether I was marrying Alex for the right reasons. He implied that our friendship had always been more meaningful than my relationship with Alex. That's when Alex lost his patience. He told Ryan that he was out of line and that his behaviour was completely inappropriate. Alex said that if Ryan really cared about me, he wouldn't be trying to sabotage my happiness on my engagement day. The argument escalated quickly, and soon other party guests started noticing the commotion on the porch. My parents came outside to see what was happening, followed by several of our friends. What should have been a private conversation became a public spectacle. Ryan finally left after my father asked him to go, but not before making one final speech about how he hoped I'd be happy with my choice, and that he'd always be there if I changed my mind. The whole thing was mortifying and completely overshadowed what should have been a celebration. The rest of the party was awkward and tense. Everyone could tell something had happened, but most people didn't know the details. Alex and I spent the remainder of the evening trying to act normal and enjoy our celebration, but the magic had definitely been broken. Ryan texted me the next day with a long apology. He said he knew he'd handled everything wrong and that he regretted the timing and the way he'd approached the situation. But he also said he didn't regret finally being honest about his feelings. I haven't spoken to Ryan since that night 3 weeks ago. Alex and I have talked extensively about what happened, and while he says he trusts me completely, I can tell the incident has affected him. He's made comments about wondering how long Ryan had been planning his confession. The hardest part is losing what I thought was my best friendship. Ryan had been such an important part of my life for so many years, and now I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were. Even if we could get past the romantic confession, the fact that he tried to undermine my engagement makes it difficult to trust him. Looking back, I wonder if there were signs I missed or if Ryan had been hiding his feelings so well that even I couldn't tell. Either way, his decision to confess at my engagement party showed a complete lack of respect for my relationship and my happiness. That story is over. Confessing your love to someone at their engagement party is bad enough, but then trying to convince them they're making a mistake while their fiancé is standing right there. That's not friendship. That's sabotage dressed up as honesty. Some moments are just too late, and this was definitely one of them. Our next story takes us into the world of property boundaries and creepy neighbours. Sometimes the person living next door has way too much interest in what's happening on your side of the fence. My neighbour built a secret tunnel into my yard. I'm 30 years old and bought my first house about 8 months ago in a quiet suburban neighbourhood. It's nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom with a decent-sized backyard where I like to garden and relax after work. My neighbour Kevin lives in the house directly behind mine. Our properties are separated by a wooden fence that was already there when I moved in. Kevin seemed friendly enough when I first met him, though he had this habit of always appearing whenever I was outside working in the yard. At first I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe he happened to be checking his mail or watering his plants whenever I was out there. But after a few months, I started noticing that Kevin seemed to know an awful lot about what I was doing in my own backyard. He'd make comments about how late I'd stayed up with my patio lights on, or mention that he'd heard me talking on the phone even though I'd been speaking quietly. When I planted new flowers along the back fence, he somehow knew exactly what varieties I'd chosen before I'd told anyone. The really weird part was that Kevin would sometimes reference things that had happened in my backyard when I was certain he couldn't have seen them from his house. His kitchen window faced the side yard, not the back, and there was no way he could have a clear view of my entire property. 3 weeks ago, I was having trouble sleeping and decided to sit outside around midnight with a cup of tea. It was a clear night, and I figured some fresh air might help me relax. I was sitting quietly on my back porch when I heard a strange scraping sound coming from somewhere near the fence. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned the yard, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a small section of my fence about 3 feet from the ground that was slowly swinging open like a door. I watched in horror as Kevin's head and shoulders emerged from what I now realized was a carefully disguised opening in the fence. He was holding a small shovel and what looked like a bag of fertilizer. He hadn't noticed me sitting on the porch yet because I'd been in the shadows. Kevin crawled through the opening and stood up in my yard like he owned the place. He walked over to my flower beds and started digging small holes, apparently planning to plant something in my garden without my permission. I sat there frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My neighbour had built some kind of secret entrance into my yard and was using it to access my property whenever he wanted. The level of violation I felt was overwhelming. I cleared my throat loudly, which caused Kevin to spin around and nearly drop his shovel. When he saw me sitting there, his face went completely white. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Kevin started stammering about how he could explain everything. He claimed he'd noticed that my flowers weren't getting enough nutrients, and he'd wanted to help by adding some fertilizer. He said he'd built the hidden door months ago because he thought it would be easier than asking permission every time he wanted to help with my yard work. I asked Kevin how long he'd been sneaking into my property, and he got defensive. He said he'd only used the tunnel a few times, and only to help with gardening tasks that I was obviously struggling with. He insisted that his intentions were good, and that I should be grateful for his assistance. When I told him that entering my property without permission was trespassing, and that I wanted him to seal up his secret entrance immediately, Kevin got angry. He said I was being ungrateful, and that most people would appreciate having such a helpful neighbour. Kevin also mentioned that he'd been keeping an eye on my house for security purposes, making sure no one was breaking in or causing trouble. He acted like he was doing me a favour by monitoring my property, apparently not realising how creepy that sounded. I told Kevin that I was calling the police if he ever set foot in my yard again, without explicit permission. I also demanded that he could understand the extent of his unauthorised construction, project me exactly how he'd modified the fence Kevin reluctantly led me to the section of fence where he'd created his secret door. It was incredibly well disguised, with hinges hidden behind fake wood panels, and a latch that was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He clearly spent significant time and effort building this thing. The tunnel itself was even more disturbing. Kevin had dug a shallow trench under the fence that allowed him to crawl from his yard into mine without being seen from either house. The whole setup showed a level of planning and dedication that was genuinely frightening. I took photos of everything and told Kevin I'd be contacting both the police and my homeowners association about his unauthorised modifications to our shared property line. He begged me not to get authorities involved, claiming it was just a misunderstanding between neighbours. Kevin spent the next hour removing his hidden door and filling in the tunnel, but the damage to any possibility of a normal neighbourly relationship was already done. I couldn't stop thinking about how many times he might have been in my yard without me knowing. The police took a report when I called them the next day, though they said it would be difficult to press charges since Kevin had removed the evidence and claimed he'd been trying to help. They did warn him officially about trespassing and advised me to install security cameras. Kevin hasn't spoken to me since that night, which is honestly a relief. He glares at me whenever he sees me in the yard, like I'm the one who did something wrong by objecting to his secret tunnel system. Some of the other neighbours have mentioned that he's complained to them about my overreaction. I've since learned that Kevin had similar issues with the previous owner of my house. Apparently, he'd made a habit of offering unsolicited yard work and getting upset when people didn't appreciate his uninvited help. I just wish someone had warned me about his boundary issues before I bought the place. That story is over. Building a secret tunnel into someone's yard and then acting like you're doing them a favour by trespassing is peak neighbour horror. The fact that he thought fertilising someone else's flowers without permission was normal behaviour makes it even more disturbing. Some people really don't understand the concept of property lines or personal boundaries. Now let's dive into a family situation that went from bad to worse when someone decided to take matters into their own hands without considering the legal consequences. My aunt tried to adopt my child without consent. I'm 25 years old and a single mother to my 3-year-old daughter Lily. Her father isn't in the picture, and it's been just the two of us since she was born. We've had our struggles, but I've worked hard to provide for her and give her a stable, loving home. My Aunt Carol has always been the type of person who thinks she knows what's best for everyone else. She's never had children of her own, but that's never stopped her from offering unsolicited parenting advice to everyone in our family. Since Lily was born, Carol has been particularly vocal about her opinions on how I should be raising my daughter. Carol has made it clear that she disapproves of my lifestyle choices. She thinks I'm too young to be a good mother, that I don't make enough money, and that Lily would be better off in a more traditional family setting. She's never directly said she wanted to take Lily away from me, but she's made plenty of comments about how things would be different if she were making the decisions. About 6 months ago, Carol started spending more time with Lily and me. She'd offer to babysit when I had to work late, take Lily shopping for clothes and toys, and generally position herself as the helpful aunt who was stepping in to provide support. I was grateful for the help and didn't think much of her increased involvement. Carol also started asking a lot of questions about my finances, my work schedule, and my living situation. She'd frame these conversations as concern for Lily's well-being, but some of her questions felt intrusive and judgmental. She'd ask why I hadn't bought a house yet, whether I was dating anyone seriously, and how I planned to pay for Lily's education. 3 months ago, I started getting calls from Child Protective Services. They said they'd received reports about Lily's living conditions and needed to do a home inspection. I was confused and terrified, but I cooperated fully because I had nothing to hide. The CPS worker who came to my apartment seemed surprised by what she found. My home was clean, well organised, and clearly child-friendly. Lily was healthy, happy, and well cared for. The worker couldn't understand why someone had reported concerns about neglect or unsafe living conditions. When I asked who had made the report, the CPS worker said she couldn't reveal that information, but she did mention that the complaints had been very detailed and specific. Someone had claimed that I left Lily alone frequently, that our apartment was unsanitary, and that I had substance abuse problems. None of these accusations were true, and the investigation was quickly closed after the home visit. But I was shaken by the experience and couldn't figure out who would make such serious false accusations against me. I started being more cautious about who I trusted with information about my personal life. Last month, I received a certified letter in the mail that made everything crystal clear. It was a legal document stating that Carol had filed a petition for guardianship of Lily, claiming that I was an unfit mother who couldn't provide adequate care for my child. The paperwork was extensive and detailed, filled with allegations about my supposed failures as a parent. Carol had documented everything from my work schedule to my social life, painting a picture of a neglectful mother who was too immature and irresponsible to raise a child. What made it even worse was that Carol had been collecting evidence for months without my knowledge. She'd taken photos of our apartment during her visits, kept records of times when I'd asked her to babysit, and even documented conversations we'd had about money troubles or work stress. Carol had used every moment of trust I'd given her as ammunition in her legal case against me. Every time I'd confided in her about the challenges of single motherhood, she'd been building a case to prove I was unfit to be Lily's guardian. I immediately contacted a lawyer who explained that Carol's petition was serious but not necessarily successful. The fact that CPS had already investigated and found no problems would work in my favour, and Carol would need to prove significant unfitness to win guardianship of someone else's biological child. My lawyer also discovered that Carol had been the one making the CPS reports, using false information to try to create an official record of problems with my parenting. She'd apparently hoped that multiple CPS investigations would strengthen her guardianship case. The legal battle was exhausting and expensive. Carol had hired her own attorney and was clearly prepared to fight for custody of Lily. She genuinely seemed to believe that she would be a better parent than me, despite having no legal right to make that decision. During depositions, Carol's true motivations became clear. She testified that she'd always wanted children and saw Lily as her opportunity to finally be a mother. She claimed that taking Lily away from me would be better for everyone involved, including me, because it would free me to live my life without the burden of single parenthood. The judge was not impressed with Carol's reasoning or her methods. After reviewing all the evidence, including the dismissed CPS investigations and Carol's admitted surveillance of my family, the court rejected her guardianship petition entirely. Carol was also ordered to pay my legal fees and warned that any future harassment or false reports could result in criminal charges. The judge made it clear that her behaviour had been inappropriate and potentially harmful to both Lily and me. The whole experience has permanently damaged my relationship with that side of my family. Several relatives supported Carol's actions, believing that she was genuinely trying to help Lily. Others were horrified by her deception and manipulation, but the damage to family unity was already done. Carol hasn't attempted to contact me or Lily since the court ruling, which is honestly a relief. I can't imagine ever trusting her again after she spent months plotting to take my daughter away from me. The betrayal cuts deeper because she used my trust and vulnerability against me. Looking back, I realised there were warning signs that Carol was planning something like this. Her increased interest in our lives, her probing questions about my personal situation, her critical comments about my parenting choices. I just never imagined she'd go as far as trying to legally steal my child. That story is over. Filing secret adoption paperwork for someone else's kid while pretending to be a supportive family member is absolutely diabolical. The calculated way she gathered evidence during visits she was invited to makes the betrayal even worse. Some people really will use any excuse to justify taking what they want, even when it means destroying families in the process. Our next story comes from the workplace, where one person's lunch theft problem got solved in the most satisfying way possible. My co-worker stole my lunch for weeks, so I spiked it. I work at a mid-sized accounting firm where we have a shared break room with refrigerators for employee lunches. For the most part, people are respectful about not taking food that doesn't belong to them, but apparently that courtesy doesn't extend to everyone. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that my lunch would occasionally go missing from the fridge. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to bring it or left it in my car by accident. But when it happened 3 times in 1 week, I realised someone was stealing my food. I'm pretty particular about my lunches because I meal prep on Sundays and make enough food for the entire work week. It's not just about the money though, that adds up too. It's about the time and effort I put into planning and preparing healthy meals. only to have someone else enjoy the fruits of my labour. I started paying more attention to who was around the break room during lunchtime, but our office has about 40 employees and people eat at different times throughout the day. It was impossible to narrow down who might be taking my food based on casual observation. The lunch thief was selective about what they stole. They'd take my main dish but leave the side salad or fruit. They'd grab my sandwich but not my chips. It was like they were shopping through my lunch and only taking the items that appealed to them most. After losing lunch for the 4th time in 2 weeks, I decided to get creative with my detective work. I started bringing different types of food and paying attention to what disappeared versus what got left behind. The pattern suggested someone with specific tastes who felt entitled to help themselves to whatever looked good. I also noticed that my lunch containers would sometimes reappear in the sink, washed and ready to be returned. The audacity of someone stealing my food and then making me wash my own containers was infuriating. They weren't even trying to hide what they were doing. 2 weeks ago, I was working late when I saw one of my co-workers, Brett, heating up what looked suspiciously like the leftover pasta I'd brought for lunch. When I casually mentioned that his dinner looked delicious, he claimed his wife had made it for him that morning. The problem was, I recognized the specific type of container he was using because I'd bought a set of those containers, specifically for meal prep. Brett was eating my food out of my own container and lying to my face about where it came from. I confronted Brett the next day, asking him directly if he'd been taking lunches from the fridge. He seemed genuinely offended by the accusation and insisted that he would never steal food from a co-worker. He said he brought his own lunch every day and couldn't believe I'd suggest otherwise. Brett's denial was so convincing that I almost doubted myself. Maybe I had been mistaken about what I'd seen, or maybe there was some innocent explanation. But that afternoon, my lunch disappeared again, and I was certain Brett was the culprit. That's when I decided to set a trap. I made my usual meal prep for the week, but I added a special ingredient to one particular container. I mixed a generous amount of ghost pepper hot sauce into what looked like a perfectly normal chicken and rice dish. Ghost pepper sauce is no joke. It's approximately 400 times hotter than a jalapeno, and even a small amount can cause serious discomfort for someone who isn't expecting it. I labelled the container with my name as usual and put it in the fridge, curious to see what would happen. The next day around noon, I heard someone in the break room making distressed noises. When I went to investigate, I found Brett standing at the sink, frantically drinking water and milk, while tears streamed down his face. He was making choking sounds and clearly in significant distress. Several co-workers had gathered to see what was wrong, and Brett was trying to explain that his lunch had been contaminated with something extremely spicy. He kept saying that someone must have accidentally mixed up containers, or that the food had gone bad in some weird way. I asked Brett to show me which lunch had caused the problem, and he reluctantly pointed to my empty container sitting on the counter. When I pointed out that the container had my name written clearly on the lid, Brett's face went even redder than it already was from the pepper. The whole break room went silent as everyone realised what had happened. Brett had been caught red-handed, stealing my lunch, and his attempt to cover it up had backfired spectacularly. He tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was literally sitting right there. Brett spent the rest of the day dealing with the after effects of the ghost pepper sauce. He had to go home early because his stomach was upset and his mouth was still burning despite drinking what seemed like gallons of milk and water. When Brett came back to work the next day, he quietly apologised for taking my lunches and promised it would never happen again. He seemed genuinely embarrassed about being caught and didn't try to make excuses or shift blame onto anyone else. The best part was that word spread quickly through the office about what had happened. Several other co-workers mentioned that they'd been having their own lunch theft problems, and suddenly those issues stopped completely. Apparently, Brett had been sampling from multiple people's meals, not just mine. My lunch has remained untouched ever since the ghost pepper incident. Brett now brings his own food every day and goes out of his way to avoid making eye contact with me in the break room. The whole experience taught everyone in the office a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property. Some people thought my solution was too extreme, but I disagree. Brett had been stealing from me and lying about it for weeks. A little discomfort from spicy food was a natural consequence of his dishonest behaviour, and it solved the problem more effectively than any conversation or complaint to HR could have. That story is over. Getting caught stealing lunch because you bit into ghost pepper sauce has got to be one of the most embarrassing ways to expose your own bad behaviour. The fact that he was stealing from multiple co-workers makes it even better that his comeuppance was so public and memorable. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that teaches everyone else a lesson too. Now let's shift gears to a story about family betrayal that hits close to home. Sometimes the people who know us best are the ones who hurt us most. I found my sister selling family heirlooms on eBay. I'm 29 years old and recently inherited my grandmother's house after she passed away 6 months ago. My grandmother, Nana Rose, had been the heart of our family for as long as I could remember. Her house was filled with decades of memories, antique furniture, and family treasures that had been passed down through generations. After Nana Rose died, my parents asked me to handle sorting through her belongings since I lived closest to her house and had always been particularly close to her. It was an emotional process, but I felt honoured to be trusted with preserving our family's history and deciding what should be kept, donated, or distributed among relatives. My sister Amy lives about 3 hours away and couldn't visit as often during the sorting process. She'd come by maybe once every few weeks to help for a day, but most of the work fell to me. I didn't mind because I knew how busy she was with her job and her 2 young kids. Amy seemed particularly interested in some of Nana's jewellery and a few pieces of antique furniture. She'd make comments about how beautiful certain items were and how much they meant to our family. I agreed that these pieces were special and assumed we'd eventually divide them fairly among family members. About 2 months ago, I was taking a break from cleaning out Nana's attic when I decided to browse eBay for some replacement parts for an old clock I was trying to repair. I was scrolling through vintage items when I saw something that made my heart stop. There was Nana's silver tea set, the one that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, listed for sale by a user named Amy_Treasures22. The listing described it as a beautiful vintage silver tea service from estate sale with a starting bid of $300. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just any silver tea set. It was the one Nana had used for every special occasion, the one she'd promised would stay in our family forever. The photos in the listing were clearly taken in Amy's living room, and the seller's username left no doubt about who was behind this. I immediately called Amy, trying to keep my voice calm. I asked her if she'd taken anything from Nana's house recently, giving her a chance to explain. Amy said she'd picked up a few small items that she thought no one would miss, just some things that had sentimental value to her. When I mentioned the tea sets specifically, Amy got defensive. She claimed that Nana had told her she could have it years ago, and that since no one else seemed to appreciate these family heirlooms, she figured she might as well sell them to people who would actually use them. I told Amy I'd seen her eBay listing and asked how many other family pieces she'd been selling without telling anyone. That's when she finally admitted she'd been taking items from Nana's house for months, starting even before Nana had died. Amy broke down and explained that she was having serious financial problems. Her husband had been laid off 6 months ago, and they were struggling to pay their mortgage and keep up with their kids' expenses. She said she'd started taking small items that she thought wouldn't be missed, then gradually moved on to more valuable pieces when she realised how much money she could make. The scope of what Amy had done was staggering. Over the course of 4 months, she'd systematically removed dozens of valuable items from Nana's house. Antique jewellery, rare books, vintage kitchenware, family photos in expensive frames, anything that might sell for decent money on eBay or at consignment shops. Amy showed me her eBay account, and I was horrified to see listings for items I'd been specifically looking for during my sorting process. A carved wooden jewellery box that had belonged to my great-grandmother, a set of china that Nana had received as a wedding gift, even some of Nana's personal jewellery that was supposed to be distributed among the granddaughters. What made it worse was that Amy had been helping me search for some of these missing items. She'd act concerned when I mentioned that I couldn't find certain pieces, suggesting that maybe they'd been misplaced or accidentally donated, all while she had them hidden in her house or already sold to strangers online. Amy begged me not to tell the rest of our family about what she'd been doing. She promised to stop selling things immediately and offered to try to buy back some of the items that hadn't shipped yet. She kept emphasizing how desperate her financial situation was and how she'd never intended for it to go this far. But the damage was already done. Amy had sold nearly $10,000 worth of family heirlooms over 4 months. Most of the buyers had already received their items and left positive feedback, meaning these pieces were scattered across the country in strangers' homes. I felt betrayed not just by the theft itself, but by the way Amy had looked me in the eye for months. While I was grieving and working to preserve our family's legacy, she'd let me stress about missing items, helped me search for things she'd already sold, and acted like a supportive sister while systematically robbing our inheritance. When I told my parents what had happened, they were devastated. My mother cried when she found out that her own mother's wedding china had been sold to someone in California. My father was angry in a way I'd rarely seen, not just about the monetary value, but about the loss of irreplaceable family history. Amy was forced to tell her husband what she'd been doing, and apparently he was as shocked as the rest of us. He'd assumed the extra money coming in was from Amy picking up freelance work, not from selling stolen family heirlooms behind everyone's back. The family decided not to press criminal charges, partly because Amy is still family, and partly because most of the items were already gone and couldn't be recovered. But Amy was completely cut off from any further involvement in settling Nana's estate, and several family members have barely spoken to her since. Amy did manage to retrieve a few items that hadn't been shipped yet, including the silver tea set that had started my investigation. But the majority of what she'd taken is gone forever, sold to collectors who have no idea they're owning pieces of someone else's family history. The worst part is knowing that Nana would have been heartbroken to learn what happened. She'd specifically kept these items in the family because she wanted them to be passed down to future generations. Instead, they're now decorating strangers' homes or sitting in antique shops somewhere. Amy's financial problems didn't justify destroying our family's legacy, but I understand that desperation can make people do things they never thought they were capable of. I just wish she'd asked for help instead of stealing from the people who loved her most. That story is over. Stealing from your own family's inheritance while pretending to help preserve it is a special kind of betrayal. The fact that she sold great-great-grandmother's tea, set to strangers, while her sister was grieving shows how desperation can corrupt even family bonds. Some losses can never be recovered, financial or otherwise. Let's move to another family gathering gone wrong, but this time involving someone who should have known better. My dad's best friend hit on me at Thanksgiving. I'm 22 years old and home from college for the holidays. Our family has always done Thanksgiving at my parents' house, and it's usually a pretty big gathering with extended family, close friends, and neighbours. It's always been one of my favourite times of the year. My dad's best friend Marcus has been part of our family celebrations for as long as I can remember. He and my dad have known each other since high school, and Marcus has been at every major family event throughout my childhood. He's married to Linda, a sweet woman who's always been like an aunt to me, and they have 2 kids who are a few years younger than me. This year's Thanksgiving started normally enough. Marcus and Linda arrived with their kids around noon, and Marcus immediately started helping my dad with the turkey preparation. They have this tradition where they argue about the best way to season the bird, and it's always entertaining to watch. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed that Marcus was paying more attention to me than usual. He kept complimenting my appearance, saying how grown up and beautiful I'd become since starting college. At first, I thought he was just being nice, the way adults often are when they see young people they've watched grow up. But Marcus's comments started getting more specific and uncomfortable. He mentioned how much he liked my outfit, asked if I had a boyfriend at school, and made remarks about how lucky any guy would be to date me. His wife was usually nearby during these conversations, but she seemed distracted by helping in the kitchen and managing their kids. During dinner, Marcus somehow ended up sitting directly across from me at the table. He kept making eye contact and smiling in a way that felt inappropriate. When he'd passed dishes to me, he'd let his hand linger on mine longer than necessary. I started feeling uncomfortable, but didn't want to cause a scene during our family gathering. After dinner, most of the adults were in the living room watching football, while the younger people cleaned up in the kitchen. Marcus came into the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher and offered to help dry dishes. I thought it was nice of him to pitch in, so I accepted his offer. That's when things got really inappropriate. Marcus started making comments about how mature I'd become and how different I seemed from the little girl he used to know. He said college had been good for me, and that I'd developed into a beautiful young woman who could have any man she wanted. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics like school and my future plans, but Marcus kept bringing it back to my appearance and my dating life. He asked detailed questions about whether I was seeing anyone seriously and whether I was happy with the guys my own age. The conversation took a disturbing turn when Marcus started talking about how young women often didn't appreciate older, more experienced men until they got tired of immature college boys. He said that men his age knew how to treat women right and could offer things that younger guys couldn't. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable, but didn't know how to extract myself from the situation without being rude. Marcus was my dad's oldest friend, someone I'd known my entire life, and I couldn't believe he was talking to me this way. Things reached a breaking point when Marcus moved closer to me at the sink and put his hand on my lower back. He leaned in and whispered that he'd always thought I was special, and that if I ever wanted to experience what it was like to be with a real man, he'd be happy to show me. I stepped away immediately and told Marcus that I wasn't interested and that his behaviour was inappropriate. He smiled and said he understood I might need time to think about it, but that his offer would always be open. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Marcus pressed the card into my hand and said I could call him any time if I wanted to talk or meet up for coffee when I was back in town. He winked and said it would be our little secret and that Linda didn't need to know about our conversation. I was shocked by his boldness and the fact that he was doing this while his wife was literally in the next room. The man I'd known as Uncle Marcus my entire life had just propositioned me at our family's Thanksgiving dinner and asked me to keep it secret from his wife. I immediately went to find my mum and asked to speak with her privately. I told her what had happened and showed her the business card Marcus had given me. My mum's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, and then determination. My mum marched into the living room where Marcus was sitting with my dad and the other adults. She asked Linda to step outside with her for a moment, then told my dad that he needed to have a serious conversation with Marcus immediately. I don't know exactly what my dad said to Marcus, but within 10 minutes, Marcus and his family were gathering their coats and leaving. Linda looked confused and kept asking what was wrong, but Marcus just said they needed to go and that he'd explain later. My dad was furious when he found out what had happened. He couldn't believe that his best friend had hit on his daughter in their own home during a family gathering. My dad called Marcus later that night and told him their friendship was over and that he was never welcome in our house again. The fallout from that Thanksgiving has been significant. My parents had to explain to other family members why Marcus and Linda suddenly weren't part of our gatherings anymore. Linda eventually found out what happened and called to apologise, saying she had no idea Marcus was capable of such behaviour. Apparently, Linda confronted Marcus about what had happened, and he initially tried to deny it. But when she found text messages on his phone from other young women, she realised this wasn't an isolated incident. Linda filed for divorce 3 months later. Marcus tried to contact me several times after Thanksgiving, sending messages through social media claiming that I'd misunderstood his intentions. He said he was just trying to be supportive and offer guidance as I transitioned into adulthood. I blocked him on all platforms and never responded. The hardest part has been dealing with the loss of someone I'd considered family my entire life. Marcus wasn't just my dad's friend. He was someone I'd trusted, someone who'd been at my birthday parties and school plays and graduation. Having that relationship corrupted by his inappropriate behaviour has been deeply unsettling. My parents have been incredibly supportive throughout this whole situation. They made it clear that I did nothing wrong and that they were proud of me for speaking up immediately instead of keeping Marcus's behaviour secret. They also made sure I knew that protecting me was more important than preserving any friendship. Looking back, I wonder if there were warning signs I missed, or if Marcus had always been capable of this kind of behaviour. Either way, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts and told my parents what happened instead of trying to handle it alone. That story is over. A family friend of 20 plus years hitting on someone he watched grow up, then asking her to keep it secret from his wife, crosses every possible line. The fact that he had a pattern of this behaviour makes it even more disgusting. Some people really will exploit any position of trust for their own twisted purposes. Moving on to a story about roommate boundaries that got completely out of hand. My roommate reported me as missing. I'm 23 years old and share a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Victoria. We met through a roommate matching service about 8 months ago, and for the most part, we get along well. Victoria is clean, pays her bills on time, and generally respects shared spaces. The only issue I've noticed is that Victoria seems to have some anxiety about being alone in the apartment. She's mentioned a few times that she doesn't like staying by herself overnight, and she's asked me to let her know when I'll be gone for extended periods so she can make arrangements to stay elsewhere. I've always been considerate about giving Victoria a heads up when I have plans to be away overnight. If I'm visiting family or staying at my girlfriend Carmen's place, I'll usually mention it in advance so Victoria can plan accordingly. It seemed like a reasonable courtesy between roommates. 3 weeks ago, Carmen and I decided to have a spontaneous weekend getaway. We'd been talking about visiting this cute bed and breakfast about 2 hours away, and on Friday afternoon, we found out they had a last-minute cancellation for that weekend. I packed a quick overnight bag and left around 6 in the evening. Victoria wasn't home when I left, so I sent her a text letting her know I'd be gone for the weekend and would be back Sunday evening. I thought that was sufficient notice for a 2-day absence. Carmen and I had an amazing weekend. We went hiking, tried local restaurants, and spent time disconnected from our phones and social media. It was exactly the kind of relaxing break we'd both needed after a stressful few weeks at work. Sunday evening, I was driving back to my apartment when my phone started buzzing with multiple missed calls and text messages. Most were from Victoria, but there were also calls from my parents, my sister, and several friends. The messages ranged from concerned to frantic. The first text from Victoria, sent Saturday morning, asked where I was and why I wasn't answering my phone. By Saturday afternoon, her messages had escalated to saying she was worried something had happened to me. By Sunday morning, she was threatening to call the police if I didn't respond immediately. What I didn't realise was that Victoria had been trying to reach me all weekend, and because Carmen and I were deliberately avoiding our phones, I hadn't seen any of her messages. From Victoria's perspective, I disappeared without a trace after sending one brief text on Friday. When I got home Sunday night, there were 2 police officers waiting in my apartment building's lobby. Victoria had filed a missing person report that afternoon, claiming that I'd been gone for 3 days without any communication and that my behaviour was completely out of character. The officers seemed relieved when I walked into the lobby, clearly alive and unharmed. They asked me a few questions about where I'd been and whether I was okay, then explained that my roommate had been very concerned about my welfare and had followed proper procedures for reporting a missing person. Victoria came downstairs when she heard voices in the lobby, and I could see she'd been crying. She immediately started yelling at me about how worried she'd been and how irresponsible it was for me to disappear without staying in constant contact. I tried to explain that I'd told her I was going away for the weekend and that I'd just been enjoying some time off the grid with my girlfriend. Victoria said that sending one text on Friday wasn't sufficient communication for a weekend absence, and that I should have been checking in regularly. The police officers suggested that Victoria and I work out a better communication system for future absences, but they seemed to think the whole situation was a misunderstanding rather than a genuine emergency. They left after confirming that I was safe and that there was no actual crime to investigate. After the officers left, Victoria and I had a long conversation about boundaries and expectations. She explained that she'd been genuinely terrified when I didn't respond to her messages, especially since I usually answered texts fairly quickly during normal circumstances. Victoria said she'd started imagining worst-case scenarios when I didn't reply to her Saturday morning check-in text. By Sunday, she was convinced something terrible had happened to me and felt like she had no choice but to contact authorities. I apologised for not realising how worried she'd be and explained that Carmen and I had intentionally unplugged from technology for the weekend. I showed Victoria the text I'd sent on Friday, which clearly stated I'd be gone until Sunday evening, but she said that wasn't specific enough. Victoria's expectations for communication seemed excessive to me. She wanted me to text her every morning and evening when I was away, provide detailed itineraries of my plans, and check in if my schedule changed at all. It felt more like reporting to a parent than living with a roommate. We tried to compromise on a reasonable communication protocol for future absences, but Victoria's anxiety about being alone seemed to drive most of her concerns. She admitted that she'd barely slept all weekend because she was worried about my safety and felt responsible for my well-being. The situation became more complicated when Victoria started asking detailed questions about my relationship with Carmen. She wanted to know how long we'd been dating, whether I trusted Carmen completely, and whether it was possible that Carmen had prevented me from communicating with Victoria. Victoria's questions made me realise that her reaction to my weekend absence wasn't just about roommate courtesy. It seemed to stem from some deeper anxiety or control issues that I wasn't qualified to address. The whole experience was embarrassing and frustrating. Having police officers waiting for me in my own building because my roommate couldn't handle 2 days of minimal communication felt like a massive overreaction to a normal adult activity. Since then, Victoria has been even more anxious about my comings and goings. She asks detailed questions about my plans, requests specific return times, and gets visibly upset if I deviate from schedules I've shared with her. Living with her has started to feel suffocating. I'm considering looking for a new living situation because Victoria's need for constant communication and her extreme reaction to normal independence don't seem compatible with healthy roommate boundaries. Some people just aren't suited for sharing living spaces with others. That story's over. Filing a missing person report because your roommate spent a weekend at a bed and breakfast without constant check-ins is peak helicopter roommate behaviour. The fact that she wanted detailed itineraries and morning-evening texts shows this was never really about safety. It was about control. Some people need to learn the difference between being considerate and being monitored. Let's dive into a story about identity theft that hits uncomfortably close to home. My uncle stole my identity to get out of debt. I'm 26 years old and thought I had a pretty good relationship with my extended family. My uncle Richard was always the fun relative at family gatherings. The guy who'd slip you $20 on your birthday and tell jokes that made everyone laugh. I never imagined he'd be capable of something like identity theft, especially not against his own family. Richard has always been a bit of a free spirit when it comes to money. He's had various jobs over the years, from selling insurance to running a small landscaping business, but nothing ever seemed to stick long term. My family would joke about Richard's creative approach to finances, but we all assumed his struggles were just temporary setbacks. About 3 months ago, I started getting calls from debt collection agencies. At first, I thought they were scam calls because I'm pretty responsible with my credit and have never carried significant debt. I'd hang up immediately or tell them they had the wrong number, But the calls kept coming, and they were getting more specific. Collectors were mentioning account numbers, dates, and amounts that sounded official. They were asking for me by name and referencing debts I'd never heard of. When I finally stayed on the line long enough to get details, I was shocked by what I heard. According to the debt collectors, I owed money on several credit cards, a personal loan, and even a car loan for a vehicle I'd never purchased. The total amount was over $30,000, and most of these accounts had been opened within the past 2 years. I immediately pulled my credit reports and discovered a financial nightmare. There were multiple credit cards in my name that I'd never applied for, loans I'd never taken out, and a credit score that had plummeted due to missed payments on accounts I didn't know existed. The addresses on these accounts were interesting. Some were my current address, but others were addresses where I'd never lived. One address in particular caught my attention because it was in a part of town where Richard had lived a few years ago. I started investigating the fraudulent accounts more carefully, looking at application dates and addresses. A pattern emerged that made my stomach drop. Most of the accounts had been opened during periods when Richard would have had access to my personal information through family events or visits. The car loan was particularly damning evidence. The vehicle had been purchased from a dealership near Richard's current house, and the loan application included employment information for a landscaping company that I knew Richard had worked for last year. I confronted Richard at my cousin's birthday party 2 weeks ago. I pulled him aside and asked him directly if he knew anything about credit accounts being opened in my name. Richard immediately got defensive and claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. But when I mentioned specific account numbers and the car loan details, Richard's demeanour changed completely. He started stammering and making excuses about how desperate his financial situation had become after his landscaping business failed. Richard admitted that he'd been using my personal information to open credit accounts for about 18 months. He claimed he'd only intended to borrow small amounts and pay everything back before I noticed. But the debts had spiraled out of control faster than he'd anticipated. The scope of Richard's fraud was staggering. He'd not only opened multiple credit cards in my name, but had also used my social security number to apply for personal loans and even to lease an apartment when his credit was too bad to qualify on his own. Richard begged me not to report him to the police, emphasizing that he was family and that involving law enforcement would destroy his relationship with everyone in our extended family. He promised he'd find a way to pay back everything he'd stolen and make the whole situation right. But the damage was already done. My credit score had dropped by over 200 points. I was being harassed by debt collectors daily, and I was facing the possibility of having wages garnished for debts I'd never incurred. I told Richard that I was giving him 1 week to come clean to the rest of our family and start the process of resolving these fraudulent accounts. If he didn't take responsibility voluntarily, I'd be filing police reports and fraud claims with all the affected creditors. Richard initially agreed to my terms, but when the week deadline passed, he'd done nothing. He stopped answering my calls and seemed to be avoiding family gatherings where he might run into me. That's when I decided to take legal action. I filed a police report for identity theft and started the process of disputing all the fraudulent accounts with credit bureaus and creditors. The paperwork was extensive and time-consuming, but I had no choice if I wanted to protect my financial future. The police investigation revealed that Richard had been even more systematic about his fraud than I'd realised. He'd kept copies of my personal documents, had been intercepting mail sent to addresses where he'd lived, and had even used my identity to open utility accounts. Richard was arrested last month and charged with multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. The family has been torn apart by the whole situation. Some relatives think I should have handled it privately, while others are horrified by what Richard did. The financial cleanup process is ongoing. While I'm not legally responsible for the fraudulent debts, removing them from my credit report and restoring my credit score is taking months. I've had to freeze my credit, change all my personal information, and constantly monitor for new fraudulent activity. Richard's wife and kids are dealing with the fallout of his criminal behaviour, which makes me feel guilty even though I know I made the right choice by reporting him. But I couldn't let someone destroy my financial future just because we shared DNA. The whole experience has made me much more cautious about sharing personal information, even with family members. I never imagined that someone I trusted could systematically steal my identity for over a year while sitting across from me at holiday dinners. Richard is facing significant jail time if convicted, and he'll likely never regain the trust of our family. The worst part is knowing that all of this could have been avoided if he'd just asked for help instead of choosing to commit crimes against his own nephew. Fraud. We're a family that helps each other through tough times, but stealing someone's identity crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. That story's over. Using your own nephew's identity to rack up $30,000 in debt while sitting at family dinners, pretending everything is normal, takes a special kind of calculated cruelty. The fact that he kept intercepting mail and systematically collecting personal documents shows this wasn't desperation. It was premeditated theft. Some betrayals cut so deep, they sever family bonds permanently. Our next story involves someone who took catfishing to a whole new level of personal violation. My ex pretended to be me on social media. I'm 24 years old and went through a pretty messy breakup with my ex-boyfriend Trevor about 6 months ago. We'd been together for 2 years, and the relationship had gotten toxic toward the end. Trevor was possessive, controlling, and had a hard time accepting that things were over between us. After we broke up, I blocked Trevor on all social media platforms and asked him not to contact me. I thought that would be the end of it, but apparently Trevor had other plans. What he did next was so bizarre and violating that I'm still dealing with the consequences months later. About 3 months after our breakup, I started getting messages from people I'd never met. They were thanking me for conversations we'd supposedly had, referencing inside jokes I'd never made, and asking about plans we'd apparently discussed. At first, I thought it was some kind of spam or mistaken identity situation. But then my friend Ashley called me with a strange question. She asked why I was posting such weird content on Instagram and why I'd been messaging her boyfriend late at night. I had no idea what she was talking about because I hadn't posted anything unusual, and I'd never messaged her boyfriend. Ashley sent me screenshots of an Instagram account that looked exactly like mine. Same profile picture, same bio information, same posting style. But the recent posts were completely out of character. Inappropriate photos, strange captions, and content that made me look like a completely different person. The fake account had been messaging people from my contacts list, having conversations as if it was really me. Trevor had apparently created a perfect replica of my social media presence and was using it to interact with my friends, family, and even strangers online. I immediately tried to report the fake account to Instagram, but the process was frustratingly slow. The account looked so authentic that even the platform's automated systems had trouble determining which one was real. Trevor had put considerable effort into making his impersonation as convincing as possible. Meanwhile, the fake version of me was wreaking havoc on my reputation. Trevor was sending flirty messages to guys I barely knew, posting controversial opinions that I didn't share, and even engaging in arguments with people I cared about. All while everyone thought it was really me. The situation got worse when I discovered that Trevor wasn't just impersonating me on Instagram. He'd created fake accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and even dating apps, all using my photos and personal information. He was living an entire online life, pretending to be me. On the dating apps, fake me was matching with guys and having explicit conversations that I would never engage in. Trevor was scheduling dates that I knew nothing about, and confused men were showing up at places expecting to meet me. Some of them even found my real social media accounts when the dates didn't happen. The most disturbing discovery was that Trevor had been using these fake accounts to gather information about my current life. He'd been messaging my friends and family members, pumping them for details about what I was doing, who I was dating, and where I was living. Trevor had essentially created a sophisticated stalking operation, disguised as social media impersonation. He was using my own identity to spy on me and manipulate my relationships with other people. The psychological violation was almost worse than the practical consequences. I started getting calls from my family members asking about strange messages they'd received from my supposed accounts. My grandmother was confused about why I'd been asking her for money. My co-workers were wondering about inappropriate comments I'd supposedly made about our boss. The fake accounts were also posting content designed to make me look unstable or unreliable. Trevor would post dramatic status updates about fake emotional crises, cancel plans I'd never made, and generally create chaos in my personal and professional relationships. I hired a lawyer who specialised in cybercrime to help me deal with the situation. She explained that what Trevor was doing constituted identity theft, harassment, and possibly revenge porn, depending on what kinds of photos he was posting on the fake accounts. Getting the accounts removed was a lengthy process that required extensive documentation proving my real identity. I had to provide government-issued ID, utility bills, and testimony from people who knew me personally. It was humiliating having to prove that I was actually myself. During the legal process, we discovered that Trevor had been even more thorough than I'd realised. He'd been screenshotting my social media activity before I blocked him, saving years' worth of photos, posts, and personal information to use in his impersonation scheme. Trevor had also been responding to messages on my behalf for months, potentially damaging relationships and opportunities I knew nothing about. Professional contacts, old friends, and even family members had been interacting with fake me, while I remained completely unaware. The police eventually got involved when we could prove that Trevor was using my identity for fraudulent purposes. He was arrested and charged with identity theft, cyberstalking, and harassment. The investigation revealed that he'd been spending hours every day maintaining these fake accounts. During questioning, Trevor claimed he was just trying to stay connected to my life because he missed me and hoped we'd get back together. He seemed genuinely surprised that anyone would consider his behaviour criminal rather than romantic. All the fake accounts were eventually removed, but the damage to my reputation and relationships took much longer to repair. I had to personally reach out to dozens of people to explain what had happened and apologise for any confusion or hurt caused by Trevor's impersonation. Some people were understanding and supportive, but others remained suspicious about whether I was telling the truth. A few relationships were permanently damaged because people couldn't get past the strange interactions they'd had with fake me. The whole experience made me much more cautious about social media and online privacy. I changed all my passwords, tightened my privacy settings, and became more selective about what personal information I shared online. Trevor pleaded guilty to the charges and received probation plus mandatory counselling. He was also ordered to stay away from me and prohibited from creating any social media accounts for 2 years. But the psychological impact of having someone live as a fake version of me online will probably last much longer. That story is over. Creating multiple fake social media accounts to impersonate your ex while gathering intel on their current life is stalking with a digital twist. The fact that he maintained this elaborate charade for months while thinking it was romantic shows how completely detached from reality some people become after breakups. Identity theft dressed up as love is still just theft. Let's move to a story about academic boundaries getting crossed in the worst possible way. My teacher tried to fail me because I rejected him. I'm 19 years old and a sophomore at a mid-sized college. Last semester, I took a literature course taught by Professor Williams, who was probably in his early 40s and had a reputation for being a demanding but fair instructor. The class was small, maybe 15 students, which meant more individual attention, but also more pressure to participate. Professor Williams seemed to take a particular interest in my work from the beginning of the semester. He'd often compliment my essays in front of the class, ask for my opinions during discussions, and suggest additional readings that might interest me. At first, I was flattered by the attention and thought it meant I was excelling in the course. About halfway through the semester, Professor Williams started asking me to stay after class to discuss my assignments. These conversations would go on for 20 or 30 minutes, and while they started as academic discussions, they gradually became more personal. He'd ask about my other classes, my career plans, and eventually my social life. Professor Williams began making comments about how mature and insightful I was compared to other students my age. He'd say things like how refreshing it was to have such an intellectually stimulating student, and how rare it was to find someone who truly appreciated literature the way I did. The conversation started making me uncomfortable when Professor Williams began sharing personal information about his own life. He'd mention problems with his marriage, his frustrations with the university administration, and how lonely academic life could be. It felt inappropriate for a professor to confide in a student this way. One afternoon, Professor Williams asked if I'd be interested in helping him with research for a book he was writing. He said it would be a great experience for my resume and that we could work together outside of class hours. The opportunity sounded legitimate, so I agreed to meet with him the following week. The research meeting took place in Professor Williams's office on a Friday evening when most of the building was empty. What should have been a professional discussion about academic research quickly turned into something much more personal and uncomfortable. Professor Williams started the meeting by telling me how special I was and how much he'd enjoyed getting to know me throughout the semester. He said he'd never met a student who understood literature and life the way I did, and that he felt a real connection between us. Then Professor Williams crossed the line completely. He told me that he was attracted to me and had been thinking about me constantly. He said that the age difference didn't matter to him, and that relationships between professors and students weren't uncommon in academic settings. I was shocked and immediately told Professor Williams that I wasn't interested in anything beyond a professional student-teacher relationship. I tried to redirect the conversation back to the research project, but he kept pushing the personal angle. Professor Williams said he understood that I might need time to think about it, but that he hoped I'd consider giving him a chance. He mentioned that he could help advance my academic career, and that having his support would be valuable as I continued my studies. The implied quid pro quo was clear. Professor Williams was suggesting that my academic success might depend on my willingness to engage in a personal relationship with him. I left his office immediately and spent the weekend trying to figure out what to do. I decided to keep things professional and pretend the conversation in his office hadn't happened. I thought maybe Professor Williams would take the hint and return to normal teacher-student interactions. I was wrong. When I submitted my next essay, Professor Williams gave it a D- with harsh comments about the quality of my analysis and writing. This was shocking because I'd been getting A's and B's on all my previous assignments, and I knew the essay was solid work. Over the next few weeks, my grades plummeted dramatically. Professor Williams would mark down every assignment, criticise my class participation, and make snide comments about students who didn't live up to their potential. It was clear that he was retaliating against me for rejecting his advances. The situation reached a breaking point when Professor Williams gave me a 0 on a major paper that counted for 25% of our final grade. His feedback claimed that I'd plagiarised sections of the essay, which was completely false. I'd written every word myself and had properly cited all my sources. I made an appointment with Professor Williams to discuss the plagiarism accusation. During our meeting, he suggested that maybe I'd been careless with my citations because I'd been distracted by personal issues. Then he offered to give me a chance to rewrite the paper if I'd be willing to discuss it over dinner. Professor Williams was essentially holding my grade hostage until I agreed to go on a date with him. When I refused again and insisted that my paper hadn't been plagiarised, he said that unfortunately he had to stand by his assessment of my work. That's when I realised I needed to involve other people in this situation. I made copies of all my graded assignments, showing the dramatic decline in my scores after rejecting Professor Williams's advances. I also started documenting our interactions in writing. I reported Professor Williams to the Dean of Students and filed a formal complaint about academic retaliation and sexual harassment. The investigation process was intimidating, but I knew I couldn't let him continue treating students this way. During the investigation, other students came forward with similar stories about Professor Williams. Apparently, his pattern of targeting female students and retaliating when they rejected him had been going on for years. I wasn't his first victim, just the first one brave enough to report it. The university took the matter seriously once multiple students provided testimony. Professor Williams was suspended pending a full investigation, and an independent instructor took over our literature course for the remainder of the semester. My grades were reviewed by a committee of faculty members who determined that Professor Williams had indeed been grading my work unfairly after I rejected his advances. All my assignments were re-evaluated, and my final grade in the course was adjusted to reflect my actual academic performance. Professor Williams was eventually fired from the university and banned from campus. The investigation revealed that he'd been abusing his position of authority for years, using grades as leverage to pressure students into inappropriate relationships. The whole experience was traumatic and affected my confidence in academic settings. I became wary of building relationships with professors and worried that other instructors might misinterpret professional interactions as personal interest. But I'm glad I spoke up when I did. The other students who came forward during the investigation deserve to have their experiences validated, and hopefully future students will be protected from Professor Williams' predatory behaviour. The university implemented new policies about faculty-student interactions and mandatory training about appropriate professional boundaries. While it's unfortunate that these safeguards were needed, I hope they'll prevent other students from going through what I experienced. That story is over. The sheer abuse of power there is disgusting. Using grades as leverage to pressure students into dating you is predatory behaviour at its worst. Thank goodness other students came forward to expose this pattern of harassment. Speaking of people who think they can control other people's major life events, this next story involves someone who decided they had the right to invite unwelcome guests to a wedding. My cousin invited my ex to her wedding without asking. I'm 25 years old, and my cousin Rebecca and I have always been close. When she got engaged last year, I was thrilled for her and immediately agreed to be in her wedding party. We spent months planning together, and I was genuinely excited to celebrate her special day. My relationship with my ex-boyfriend Nathan ended badly about 18 months ago. We'd been together for 3 years, but the relationship became toxic toward the end. Nathan was manipulative and emotionally abusive, and leaving him was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It took months of therapy to recover from the damage he'd caused to my self-esteem and mental health. After we broke up, I made it clear to everyone in my family that I didn't want Nathan in my life anymore. I'd blocked him on social media, changed my phone number, and asked relatives not to share information about my life with him. Most of my family respected these boundaries and understood why the breakup had been so difficult. Rebecca knew all about my relationship with Nathan and how badly it had ended. She'd been supportive during the breakup and had even helped me move out of the apartment Nathan and I had shared. I thought she understood how important it was for me to maintain distance from him. 2 weeks before Rebecca's wedding, I was helping her finalise seating charts when I noticed a familiar name on the guest list. Nathan Rodriguez was listed at table 6, right next to the head table where I'd be sitting as part of the wedding party. My stomach dropped when I saw his name there. I asked Rebecca why Nathan was invited, thinking maybe it was some kind of mistake or leftover from an old draft of the guest list. Rebecca got defensive immediately and said she'd invited Nathan because he was part of our extended social circle, and she wanted all her friends there. I reminded Rebecca about everything Nathan had put me through, and how uncomfortable his presence would make me. I explained that being forced to spend an entire evening in the same room as my abusive ex would ruin what should be a celebration for both of us. Rebecca's response shocked me. She said I was being dramatic and that I needed to get over what had happened with Nathan. She claimed that enough time had passed and that I should be mature enough to handle being around him for one night. Rebecca also mentioned that Nathan had been asking about me and seemed genuinely sorry about how things had ended. She thought maybe seeing each other at the wedding might give us a chance to get closure and possibly even rekindle our friendship. The idea that Rebecca thought I'd want to reconcile with Nathan showed how little she understood about what I'd been through. Nathan hadn't just been a bad boyfriend, he'd been emotionally abusive and controlling. There was no scenario where I'd want him back in my life. I told Rebecca that I wouldn't be able to attend the wedding if Nathan was going to be there. It wasn't an ultimatum or a threat, it was just the reality of what I needed to do to protect my mental health. Being around Nathan would trigger anxiety and undo months of healing. Rebecca got angry and accused me of trying to control her guest list and ruin her wedding. She said I was being selfish for making her choose between her cousin and her friend, and that a good family member would just suck it up for one night. I tried to explain that this wasn't about controlling anyone or being difficult. It was about protecting myself from someone who had caused me serious emotional harm. I offered to help with the wedding in other ways if she really wanted Nathan there, but I couldn't be present at the same event. Rebecca refused to budge on the issue. She said Nathan was staying on the guest list and that I could either come and deal with it like an adult or miss out on her special day. She made it sound like my trauma response was just me being petty or vindictive. The conversation ended with both of us upset and no resolution. I spent the next few days hoping Rebecca would reconsider, but she never reached out to discuss it further. It became clear that she valued Nathan's presence at her wedding more than my comfort and well-being. I made the difficult decision not to attend Rebecca's wedding. I sent her a heartfelt letter, explaining my choice and wishing her happiness, but I couldn't put myself in a situation that would be harmful to my mental health just to avoid disappointing her. The fallout from missing the wedding has been significant. Several family members have sided with Rebecca, saying I should have just attended and avoided Nathan during the reception. They think I overreacted and created unnecessary drama during what should have been a happy time. Other family members understand why I made the choice I did, especially those who witnessed what Nathan put me through during our relationship. But the family is definitely divided, and some relationships may never fully recover from this conflict. Rebecca and I haven't spoken since her wedding 3 months ago. I've heard through other relatives that she had a beautiful ceremony and seemed happy on her special day. Part of me is glad she got the wedding she wanted, even if it meant I couldn't be there. The hardest part is losing a relationship that had been important to me for my entire life. Rebecca and I grew up together, shared countless memories, and supported each other through difficult times. But her decision to prioritize Nathan's attendance over my well-being showed me something about her character that I can't unsee. I don't regret my choice to protect myself, even though it cost me a relationship with my cousin. Sometimes you have to choose your own healing over keeping other people comfortable, and that's exactly what I did. That story is over. Inviting someone's abusive ex to your wedding and then calling them dramatic for not wanting to attend is peak selfish behaviour. The fact that she thought they might rekindle their friendship shows she completely ignored everything about why that relationship ended. Family should protect you, not expose you to people who've hurt you. Our next story takes us into the workplace, where someone discovered their boss was running a very illegal side hustle right under everyone's noses. I found out my boss was running an illegal side business. I'm 23 years old and work as an administrative assistant at a small import company downtown. The job seemed pretty straightforward when I started. Filing paperwork, answering phones, and helping coordinate shipments for various clients who needed products brought in from overseas. My boss, Mr. Peterson, always seemed a bit secretive about certain aspects of the business. He'd handle some client meetings personally and would often work late hours when the rest of the staff had gone home. I figured he was just dedicated to his work and wanted to maintain close relationships with important clients. About 4 months ago, I started noticing some inconsistencies in the paperwork I was processing. We'd receive shipments that didn't match the documentation I'd filed earlier, or I'd find invoices for products that didn't appear anywhere in our official inventory system. When I asked Mr. Peterson about these discrepancies, he'd always have explanations that sounded reasonable, but felt somewhat evasive. He'd say there had been last-minute changes to orders, or that some clients preferred to handle certain transactions directly with him to maintain privacy. The first real red flag came when I accidentally opened a box that had been delivered to our warehouse. I was looking for office supplies and grabbed what I thought was a shipment of promotional materials. Instead, I found dozens of designer handbags that looked suspiciously high quality for the price listed on our inventory sheets. The bags were labelled as authentic luxury items from well-known brands, but something about them seemed off. The stitching was slightly uneven, the hardware felt lightweight, and the packaging looked different from authentic products I'd seen in department stores. I mentioned the handbag shipment to Mr. Peterson, asking if there had been a mistake with the labelling or if these were sample products for a new client. He seemed nervous about my questions and quickly moved the boxes to a locked storage room that employees weren't supposed to access. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the types of products we were importing and the clients who were purchasing them. A pattern emerged that made me increasingly uncomfortable about what was really going on at our company. We were receiving regular shipments of luxury goods, handbags, watches, jewellery, electronics, all labelled with premium brand names, but priced far below what authentic versions would cost. These items were being sold to clients who seemed to understand that they weren't getting genuine products. The clients who purchased these questionable items always paid in cash and never required detailed receipts or warranty information. They'd come in quickly, examine the merchandise briefly, and leave with large quantities of products that they clearly intended to resell elsewhere. I realised that Mr. Peterson was running a counterfeit goods operation using our legitimate import business as a front. He was bringing in fake luxury items from overseas manufacturers and selling them to dealers who would then distribute them as authentic products to unsuspecting customers. The illegal operation was sophisticated and well organised. Mr. Peterson had established relationships with factories overseas that specialised in producing high-quality knockoffs, and he'd built a network of local distributors who were eager to buy these products at wholesale prices. What made the situation even more concerning was that our legitimate business was being used to launder the profits from the counterfeit sales. The paperwork I was processing included fake invoices and documentation designed to make the illegal transactions appear like normal business activities. I found myself in an impossible position. I needed my job and couldn't afford to lose my income, but I was uncomfortable being unknowingly involved in illegal activities. Every piece of paperwork I processed might be contributing to fraudulent transactions. The decision to report Mr. Peterson wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't continue working for a company that was engaged in criminal activities. I started documenting everything I could find: suspicious shipments, questionable client interactions, and financial discrepancies that suggested money laundering. I contacted the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit and provided them with copies of the evidence I'd collected. The agent I spoke with said that counterfeit goods operations like the one I'd described were serious crimes that hurt both legitimate businesses and consumers who unknowingly purchased fake products. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement got involved. Within 2 weeks, federal agents had obtained search warrants for our office and warehouse. They seized thousands of counterfeit items and arrested Mr. The Raid. I learned that the counterfeit operation was Peterson, along with several of his distributors, during much larger than I'd realised. Mr. Peterson had been running this illegal business for over 3 years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in profits while putting our legitimate employees at legal risk. The legitimate import business was shut down during the investigation, which meant I lost my job along with several other innocent employees. We were all cleared of any wrongdoing, but finding new employment while explaining why my previous workplace was raided by federal agents has been challenging. Mr. Peterson pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including trafficking in counterfeit goods, money laundering, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution to the brands whose products he'd been counterfeiting. The whole experience taught me to pay attention when workplace activities seem suspicious or inconsistent. I'm glad I reported what I discovered, even though it cost me my job. Counterfeit goods operations harm legitimate businesses and deceive consumers who think they're buying authentic products. Looking back, there were probably warning signs I missed earlier in my employment. Mr. Peterson's secretive behaviour, the unusual client interactions, and the discrepancies in our paperwork should have raised red flags sooner than they did. That story is over. Finding out your entire workplace is a front for a counterfeit goods operation is like discovering you've been living in a crime movie without knowing it. At least she did the right thing by reporting it, even though it cost her the job. Some situations are bigger than just keeping your paycheck. Now let's dive into a family story that shows how far some people will go to avoid taking responsibility for their own academic failures. My sister tried to switch report cards with me. I'm 17 years old and my sister Ashley is 15. We go to the same high school, and while we've always been competitive about grades, things got really weird last semester when her academic performance took a serious nosedive. Ashley has always been a decent student, usually pulling B's and C's without too much effort. But sophomore year hit her hard. She started hanging out with a different crowd, stopped doing homework regularly, and basically checked out of caring about school altogether. Meanwhile, I was having one of my best semesters academically. I'd been working really hard in my AP classes and managed to maintain a 3.8 GPA while Ashley's grades were dropping into D&F territory. Our parents were starting to notice the difference in our academic performance. The week before report cards came out, Ashley seemed unusually stressed and kept asking me weird questions about my grades. She wanted to know exactly what I'd gotten in each class and whether I thought our parents would be proud of my performance. I didn't think much of her questions at the time. Ashley had always been curious about my grades, especially when she was struggling in her own classes. I figured she was just feeling insecure about the comparison our parents would inevitably make. Report card day arrived on a Friday, and students were supposed to take them home over the weekend to get parental signatures. Ashley and I both received our sealed envelopes during homeroom and were supposed to bring them back signed on Monday morning. I opened my report card during lunch and was thrilled to see that I'd maintained my high GPA and even improved in a couple of subjects. Ashley, however, looked pale when she opened hers and quickly shoved the paper back into the envelope without letting anyone see it. That evening, our parents asked to see our report cards during dinner. I proudly handed mine over and watched as they beamed with pride over my academic achievements. Ashley claimed she'd left hers in her locker and would show them tomorrow. The next morning, Ashley was acting strange and kept hovering around my backpack and desk area. She offered to help me organise my school stuff, which was completely out of character for her. I thought maybe she was just being nice or trying to procrastinate on her own homework. On Sunday evening, I went to get my report card so our parents could sign it before I returned it to school. But when I opened the envelope, I found Ashley's report card inside instead of mine. Her name was at the top, but someone had clearly tried to erase it and write my name over it. The attempted name swap was obvious and sloppy. Ashley had used a different pen, and you could still see traces of her original name underneath the overwriting. She'd also tried to change some of the grades, but the alterations were equally obvious to anyone who looked closely. I immediately went to find Ashley and confronted her about switching our report cards. At first, she tried to deny it and claimed there must have been some mistake. But when I showed her the evidence of tampering, she broke down and admitted what she'd done. Ashley explained that she was terrified of showing our parents her real grades. She'd failed 2 classes and was barely passing the others, which would mean losing privileges, being grounded, and possibly having to repeat courses during summer school. Her plan was to show our parents my report card with her name on it, forge their signatures, and then return the fake document to school. She thought she could buy herself time to improve her grades before anyone figured out what was really happening. I pointed out all the flaws in her plan. The name changes were obvious, the grades had been altered poorly, and she'd have to maintain this deception indefinitely. Plus, she was asking me to participate in academic fraud that could get both of us in serious trouble. Ashley begged me not to tell our parents about the switch, promising she'd come clean about her real grades if I'd just keep quiet about her attempt to deceive them. She seemed genuinely panicked about the consequences she'd face for both the bad grades and the attempted fraud. I felt bad for Ashley, but I couldn't let her turn in a forged report card with my name on it. If the school discovered the tampering, it would reflect poorly on my academic integrity and could affect my college applications. That evening, I told our parents everything. I showed them both report cards and explained how Ashley had tried to switch them and alter the information. Our parents were disappointed, but not entirely surprised. They'd suspected Ashley was struggling more than she'd been admitting. The consequences for Ashley were significant. She was grounded for a month, lost her phone and computer privileges, and had to meet with the school counsellor to discuss her academic struggles and the cheating incident. Our parents also arranged for tutoring to help her improve her grades. Ashley was angry with me for weeks after I exposed her plan. She claimed I'd ruined her life and that I should have helped her cover up the grade situation instead of getting her in trouble. She seemed to think family loyalty meant participating in academic fraud. But our parents made it clear that what Ashley had done was serious, not just the bad grades, but the attempt to deceive them and the school through document tampering. They emphasized that academic integrity was more important than protecting someone from the consequences of their choices. The whole situation actually ended up helping Ashley in the long run. The tutoring and increased parental oversight helped her bring her grades up significantly by the end of the semester. She also learned that trying to avoid problems through deception usually makes things much worse. Looking back, I think Ashley's plan was doomed from the start. The name switching was too obvious, and maintaining a lie that complex would have been impossible. I'm glad I didn't get dragged into her scheme, even though it caused temporary tension between us. That story is over. Trying to erase your sister's name and write yours over it on a report card is such a desperate move that it's almost sad. The fact that she thought this obvious forgery would fool anyone shows how panic can make people attempt the most ridiculous schemes. At least it led to her getting the help she actually needed. Our next story involves a parent who took control to a disturbing new level by literally hiding important documents. My mum hid my birth certificate. I'm 18 years old and just graduated from high school with plans to attend college in another state. I've been accepted to my dream school about 6 hours away from home, and I was excited to start this new chapter of my life. That excitement quickly turned to frustration when I discovered what my mum had been hiding from me. Throughout my senior year, my mum had been increasingly vocal about her concerns regarding my college choice. She wanted me to stay local and attend the community college in our town, where I could continue living at home and she could keep an eye on me. I understood her concerns about me moving far away. I'm an only child and we've always been close. But I'd worked hard to get into a competitive program at a university that would set me up for my career goals. The local community college didn't offer the specialised courses I needed. When it came time to complete my college enrolment paperwork, I needed several important documents, including my birth certificate and social security card. I asked my mum to help me locate these documents, since she'd always handled our family's important paperwork. My mum kept saying she'd help me find the documents later, but weeks went by without her producing them. Every time I brought it up, she'd change the subject or say she was too busy to look through our files. The enrolment deadline was approaching, and I was getting anxious. I decided to search for the documents myself, figuring they were probably in the filing cabinet where we kept other important papers. But when I looked through every folder and drawer, I couldn't find my birth certificate, social security card, or passport anywhere. When I told my mum I couldn't locate any of my identification documents, she seemed surprisingly unconcerned. She suggested that maybe I should reconsider my college plans and look into local options that might not require as much paperwork. That's when I realised something suspicious was going on. These weren't documents that could just disappear. They were too important to be misplaced accidentally. I started wondering if my mum had deliberately hidden them to prevent me from enrolling in the out-of-state school. I confronted my mum directly and asked if she knew where my documents were. She maintained that she had no idea what had happened to them and suggested we could order replacement copies if needed. But the process for getting replacement documents would take weeks, potentially causing me to miss enrolment deadlines. My mum's suggestion that we eventually get replacement documents confirmed my suspicions. She was deliberately stalling the process to make it difficult or impossible for me to enroll in my chosen college on time. I told my mum that I suspected she was hiding my documents and that preventing me from accessing my own identification was wrong. She got defensive and accused me of being paranoid and disrespectful for suggesting she would sabotage my college plans. But I knew my mum well enough to recognise when she was being evasive. Her body language and responses were all wrong. She was definitely hiding something from me. I decided I needed to search more thoroughly and systematically. When my mum left for work the next day, I searched our entire house methodically. I looked in places where important documents would never normally be stored, inside books, in clothing drawers, even in the freezer and other random locations. Finally, I found my documents hidden in a plastic bag inside a box of old Christmas decorations in our basement. Along with my birth certificate and social security card, there were acceptance letters and scholarship information from my chosen college that had been delivered months earlier. My mum had been intercepting my college-related mail and hiding it along with my identification documents. She'd been systematically sabotaging my enrolment process while pretending to be supportive of my college plans. When my mum came home that evening, I confronted her with the evidence. She broke down and admitted that she'd been terrified of me leaving home and had hoped that creating obstacles would convince me to stay local. She claimed she was just trying to protect me from making a mistake. I explained to my mum that hiding my legal documents and intercepting my mail was wrong, regardless of her motivations. These weren't her decisions to make. I was 18 years old and had the right to access my own identification and correspondence. My mum apologised and said she realised her actions had been inappropriate, but the damage was already done. I'd missed several important deadlines because of her interference, and some scholarship opportunities were no longer available due to the delay she'd caused. I was able to complete my enrolment just before the final deadline, but the stress and uncertainty my mum had created made what should have been an exciting time feel chaotic and conflict-ridden. The trust between us had been seriously damaged. The experience taught me that I needed to be more independent and couldn't rely on my mum to always act in my best interests. She loved me, but her fear of losing me had caused her to make decisions that were ultimately harmful to my future. I'm now attending my chosen college and doing well in my program. My relationship with my mum is slowly healing, but it took months of difficult conversations for her to understand how her actions had affected me and violated my autonomy as an adult. That story is over. Hiding your own child's birth certificate and intercepting their college mail is next-level controlling behaviour disguised as protection. The fact that she stashed everything in Christmas decorations like some kind of deranged hiding game shows how far parental anxiety can spiral into sabotage. At least she got to college in the end, but that trust damage is going to last a while. Moving on to a story about digital harassment that crossed every possible line of decency and legality. My ex sent fake photos of me around school. I'm 16 years old and dealing with one of the most humiliating situations I can imagine. My ex-boyfriend Connor and I broke up about 2 months ago after dating for almost a year. The breakup was messy. Connor didn't want it to end and kept trying to convince me to get back together even after I made it clear I was done with the relationship. Connor had always been a bit possessive during our relationship, but I thought his behaviour would improve after we broke up and he had time to process things. Instead, he became increasingly hostile and started making comments about how he was going to make me regret leaving him. About 3 weeks ago, I started getting strange looks from classmates at school. People would stare at me in the hallways, whisper when I walked by, and some of my friends seemed uncomfortable around me. I couldn't figure out what was going on until my best friend Taylor pulled me aside after lunch. Taylor showed me her phone with a sick expression on her face. Someone had been sending around explicit photos that were supposedly of me, but I knew immediately that they were fake. The images had been digitally manipulated to put my face on someone else's body. The photos looked convincing enough that people who didn't know me well might believe they were real. Connor had used pictures from my social media accounts and somehow merged them with inappropriate images to create fake explicit content that he was distributing around our school. Taylor said the photos had been circulating through text messages and social media for at least a week. Students were sharing them through group chats and private messages, and some people had even posted them on anonymous social media accounts. I felt sick to my stomach realizing that hundreds of my classmates had probably seen these fake images and believed they were real. My reputation was being destroyed by someone who was supposed to have cared about me, all because I'd ended our relationship. I immediately went to the school administration and reported what was happening. The assistant principal took the situation seriously and said they'd investigate, but the damage was already spreading faster than they could contain it. The school contacted the police, since distributing fake explicit images of minors constitutes several serious crimes, including harassment, cyberbullying, and potentially child exploitation charges. The officer who took my statement said these cases were becoming more common as photo editing technology became more accessible. Meanwhile, I had to continue attending school while knowing that many of my classmates had seen these fake images. Some people were supportive once they learned the photos were manipulated, but others seemed to assume that even fake explicit images meant I had somehow been involved in creating inappropriate content. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement got involved. They were able to trace the original source of the images back to Connor's social media accounts and phone records. Connor had been systematically sending the fake photos to multiple students and encouraging them to share the images further. When Connor was confronted with the evidence, he initially tried to deny involvement, but the digital trail was clear. The fake images had been created and distributed from his devices, and he'd left a clear pattern of harassment through his messaging activity. Connor was arrested and charged with multiple crimes related to cyberbullying and distributing fake explicit images. The charges were serious enough that he was expelled from school and faced potential juvenile detention time if convicted. The legal process was difficult and embarrassing. I had to give detailed testimony about the harassment and provide evidence of how the fake images had affected my life at school. The whole experience was traumatic, but I knew it was important to hold Connor accountable for what he'd done. Connor's parents seemed shocked by their son's behaviour and apologised profusely for what he'd put me through. They said they had no idea he was capable of something so malicious and promised to get him counselling to address his issues with anger and rejection. The school implemented new policies about cyberbullying and digital harassment after my case. They also brought in speakers to educate students about the serious legal consequences of creating or sharing fake explicit images, especially involving minors. Most of the fake images were eventually removed from social media platforms and group chats, but I know some copies probably still exist somewhere online. The thought that these manipulated photos of me might resurface someday is something I'll have to live with permanently. Connor pleaded guilty to the charges and received probation, community service, and mandatory counselling. He was also required to write a formal apology letter, acknowledging the harm he'd caused and explaining that the images were completely fake. The whole experience changed how I think about relationships and digital privacy. I'm much more careful about what photos I post online and who I trust with personal information. Connor's actions showed me how someone's anger over a breakup can lead them to commit serious crimes. Some of my classmates were supportive throughout the ordeal, but others seemed to enjoy the drama or continued to treat me differently, even after learning the images were fake. The social impact of Connor's revenge scheme lasted much longer than the legal consequences he faced. I'm grateful that I reported what happened instead of trying to handle it quietly. Connor's behaviour was criminal, and he needed to face real consequences for attempting to destroy my reputation through fake explicit images. That story is over. Creating and distributing fake explicit images of your ex is basically digital sexual assault, and the fact that he was systematically sending them around school makes it even more calculated and cruel. Some people really think revenge justifies committing serious crimes that could ruin someone's life permanently. Let's move to a story about family boundaries getting trampled in the name of togetherness. My brother tried to crash my honeymoon. I'm 28 years old and just got married to my wonderful wife Carmen last month. We'd been planning our dream honeymoon to Costa Rica for over a year, a 2-week adventure through rainforests, beaches, and wildlife reserves that we'd saved up for by working overtime and cutting expenses. My younger brother Brandon is 25 and has always had boundary issues when it comes to my relationships. He's the type who shows up uninvited to date nights, calls constantly when I'm spending time with Carmen, and generally acts like he should be included in every aspect of my life. When Carmen and I got engaged, Brandon immediately started asking about wedding details and honeymoon plans. He seemed unusually interested in where we were going and what activities we had planned. I shared some basic information because I thought he was just being supportive and excited for us. About 2 months before our wedding, Brandon started making comments about how he'd never been to Costa Rica and how amazing it would be to visit there someday. He'd bring it up repeatedly during family dinners and always in the context of our upcoming honeymoon trip. I didn't think much of his comments at first. Lots of people express interest in travel destinations when you mention you're going somewhere exotic. I figured Brandon was just making conversation, or maybe planning his own future trip based on our recommendations. The week before our wedding, Brandon asked if Carmen and I had room in our luggage to bring back souvenirs for him. He gave me a detailed list of specific items he wanted from Costa Rica, which seemed oddly presumptuous, but I agreed to try to accommodate some of his requests. Our wedding was beautiful, and everything went perfectly. Carmen and I were exhausted, but thrilled as we headed to the airport the next morning for our 2-week honeymoon adventure. We were looking forward to finally relaxing and enjoying our first trip as a married couple. We arrived at our first resort in Manuel Antonio and were checking in when I got a text from Brandon. He said he had a surprise for us and that we should check our room carefully when we got settled. I assumed he'd arranged for champagne or flowers to be delivered as a sweet gesture. Carmen and I went to our ocean view suite and were unpacking when there was a knock at the door. I opened it expecting room service or hotel staff, but instead found Brandon standing there with a huge grin and a backpack, clearly dressed for a tropical vacation. I stared at him in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. Brandon announced that he'd booked himself into the same resort as a surprise, saying he wanted to share this amazing experience with his brother and new sister-in-law. He seemed genuinely excited and expected us to be thrilled by his spontaneous decision. Carmen's face went completely white when she saw Brandon at our door. This was supposed to be our intimate time together as newlyweds, and suddenly my brother was standing there, expecting to be included in our honeymoon activities. I asked Brandon how he'd even known where we were staying, since we hadn't shared specific resort information with family members. He admitted that he'd been looking through my email when I was at his apartment a few weeks earlier and had written down our booking details. Brandon had used our private reservation information to book himself a room at the exact same resort during the exact same dates as our honeymoon. He'd planned this intrusion for weeks without telling anyone, apparently thinking it would be a welcome surprise. I told Brandon that this was completely inappropriate and that he needed to find somewhere else to stay. Carmen and I had planned this trip as our honeymoon, a private, romantic getaway for just the two of us. His presence would completely change the entire experience. Brandon got defensive and said he'd spent a lot of money on the trip and couldn't just cancel his reservation. He claimed he wasn't trying to intrude on our romance, just wanted to enjoy Costa Rica at the same time and maybe join us for some group activities. Carmen was getting upset, and I could see that Brandon's surprise was already ruining what should have been the start of our perfect honeymoon. I told him firmly that he needed to leave and find alternative accommodations, but he refused. Brandon said he'd booked activities through the resort and had dinner reservations that couldn't be changed. He kept insisting that there was plenty of room for all of us to enjoy Costa Rica together, and that families should share special experiences. The situation escalated when Brandon started following us around the resort. When we went to the pool, he'd show up with a chair. When we went to dinner, he'd try to join our table. When we booked couples activities, he'd ask if there was space for one more person. Carmen was in tears by the second day of what was supposed to be our dream honeymoon. Every romantic moment was interrupted by my brother inserting himself into our plans. We couldn't have a private conversation without Brandon appearing to join the discussion. I finally called resort security and explained the situation. They were sympathetic and helped us move to a different resort about an hour away, but we'd already lost 2 days of our carefully planned itinerary and had to pay additional fees for the last-minute changes. Brandon sent angry messages accusing us of abandoning him in a foreign country and ruining his vacation. He seemed genuinely confused about why we were upset, apparently believing that his surprise visit was a generous gift rather than a massive violation of boundaries. The rest of our honeymoon was wonderful once we got away from Brandon, but the whole experience left a permanent stain on what should have been perfect memories. Carmen and I still talk about how differently those first few days could have gone without my brother's intrusion. When we returned home, Brandon was still angry and complained to our parents about how we'd treated him. Some family members thought we'd overreacted, while others understood why we'd needed to establish boundaries around our honeymoon. Brandon and I didn't speak for 2 months after the incident. Our relationship has slowly improved since then, but I've made it clear that he can never again insert himself into my plans without explicit permission. Some surprises are just unwelcome intrusions disguised as thoughtful gestures. That story's over. Crashing someone's honeymoon because you've never been to Costa Rica is so delusional, it's almost impressive. The fact that he went through private emails to get their booking information and then acted surprised when they weren't thrilled shows a complete disconnect from reality. Some people really think being family gives them access to every moment of your life. Our next story involves technology being used in the most petty way imaginable to monitor someone else's viewing habits. My friend used my Netflix to cheat. I'm 21 years old and share a Netflix account with my longtime friend Austin. We've been splitting streaming service costs since college as a way to save money, and it's always worked out well since we have different viewing preferences and rarely conflict over what to watch. Austin has been dating his girlfriend Chloe for about 2 years, and they seem to have a pretty solid relationship. They live together, share most activities, and generally appear to be a happy couple. I've hung out with both of them plenty of times and never noticed any red flags or relationship drama. About 3 months ago, I started noticing some strange activity on our shared Netflix account. Someone was watching romantic comedies and drama series that neither Austin nor I had ever shown interest in. At first, I figured maybe Austin's tastes were evolving, or he was exploring different genres. But then I noticed that these mystery viewing sessions were happening at odd hours, usually late at night, or during times when I knew Austin was at work or busy with other commitments. The viewing patterns didn't match his normal schedule or habits. I mentioned the strange activity to Austin, joking that maybe our account had been hacked or someone else had figured out our password. Austin laughed it off and said he'd been trying out some new shows, but his response seemed a bit forced and uncomfortable. The mystery deepened when I started paying closer attention to what was being watched and when. The romantic content was being viewed consistently during afternoons when Austin was supposedly working his regular day shift. Either he was lying about his work schedule or someone else was using our account. One day, I decided to check the account activity in more detail using Netflix's viewing history feature. What I discovered was a clear pattern of two different types of content being consumed: Austin's usual action movies and sports documentaries during his normal free time, and romantic shows during hours when he claimed to be unavailable. The romantic viewing sessions were also creating multiple user profiles that I hadn't authorized. Someone had been setting up separate profiles with names like Movie Night and Cozy Time to keep their viewing history separate from the main account activity. I confronted Austin again, this time with specific evidence about the viewing times and unauthorized profiles. He initially stuck to his story about exploring new genres, but when I pressed him about the timing discrepancies, he finally admitted what was really going on. Austin confessed that he'd been having an affair with a co-worker named Lindsay for the past few months. They'd been meeting at her apartment during his lunch breaks and after work, and he'd been using our Netflix account to watch movies together as part of their dating routine. The romantic comedies and drama series weren't Austin's new interests. They were what he and Lindsay enjoyed watching together during their secret meetups. He'd been essentially using our shared streaming account to facilitate his cheating by providing entertainment for his dates with another woman. I was stunned by Austin's admission, not just because he was cheating on Chloe, but because he'd been using our shared account as part of his deception. Every time I saw those romantic movies in our viewing history, I was seeing evidence of his affair without realizing it. Austin begged me not to tell Chloe about what I'd discovered. He claimed that his relationship with Lindsay was just a phase and that he was planning to end it soon. He promised he'd stop using our Netflix account for his cheating activities if I'd keep quiet about the situation. I told Austin that I couldn't be complicit in his deception of Chloe, especially since I considered her a friend too. She deserved to know that her boyfriend was being unfaithful, and I couldn't pretend I didn't have evidence of his affair. Austin got angry and accused me of being a terrible friend for not supporting him through a difficult time in his relationship. He claimed that telling Chloe would only hurt her unnecessarily, and that I should mind my own business about their personal issues. But I felt like Austin had made it my business by using our shared account as part of his cheating scheme. I'd been unwittingly providing the entertainment for his secret dates, and continuing to keep quiet would make me feel like an accomplice. I gave Austin a week to tell Chloe himself before I would share what I'd discovered. He spent that time trying to convince me to change my mind, alternating between guilt trips about friendship, loyalty, and threats about ending our financial arrangement. When the deadline passed without Austin confessing, I told Chloe everything. I showed her the Netflix viewing history and explained how I'd figured out what was happening. She was devastated but grateful to finally understand why Austin had been acting so distant and secretive. Chloe confronted Austin with the evidence, and their relationship ended immediately. Austin blamed me for destroying his fair relationship and claimed I'd betrayed our friendship by interfering in his personal life. The whole situation was messy and uncomfortable. I lost a close friend, but I couldn't live with knowing about his affair and staying silent. Chloe deserved better than being deceived by someone she trusted, and I couldn't be part of covering up his betrayal. I ended up cancelling our shared streaming accounts and cutting ties with Austin completely. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you relationships, but I couldn't prioritize friendship over basic honesty and decency. That story is over, Using your shared Netflix account to facilitate cheating is peak cheapskate behavior disguised as betrayal. The fact that he got mad when caught instead of being ashamed shows exactly why he was capable of cheating in the first place. Some people really will use any resource available to them for their own selfish purposes, even if it drags innocent friends into their deception. Now let's dive into a workplace story that shows how some people will go to extreme lengths to avoid taking responsibility for their own mistakes. My dad showed up drunk to my job interview. I'm 22 years old and recently graduated from college with a business degree. After months of job searching, I finally landed an interview at a prestigious consulting firm downtown. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward throughout college, and I was incredibly nervous but excited. My dad has always had a complicated relationship with alcohol. He's what you might call a functional alcoholic. He holds down a job and pays his bills, but he drinks heavily most evenings and weekends. Our family has learned to work around his drinking, but it's always been a source of tension. The night before my interview, I mentioned to my parents how important this opportunity was and how nervous I felt about making a good impression. My dad seemed supportive and even offered some advice about interview techniques and how to present myself professionally. The interview was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I arrived early, dressed in my best suit, with copies of my resume and a portfolio of college projects I thought might impress the hiring manager. I felt prepared and confident as I checked in with the receptionist. About 10 minutes before my scheduled time, there was a commotion in the lobby. I heard raised voices and turned to see someone arguing with the security guard near the elevators. My heart sank when I realized the person causing the disturbance was my dad. My dad was clearly intoxicated, swaying slightly and speaking too loudly. He was wearing wrinkled clothes and had obviously been drinking for hours. He kept insisting that he needed to get upstairs to support his daughter during her important interview. The security guard was trying to calm him down and explain that he couldn't just wander around the building without an appointment. My dad was getting increasingly agitated and started demanding to speak with whoever was in charge of hiring decisions. I was mortified. Here I was, trying to make the best possible impression on potential employers, while my drunk father was causing a scene in their lobby. I could see other people in business attire staring at the situation and whispering among themselves. I approached the security guard and quietly identified myself as the person my dad was talking about. I apologized for the disruption and tried to convince my dad to leave peacefully. But he was too drunk to understand the gravity of what he was doing. My dad kept loudly proclaiming how proud he was of me and how these people needed to know what a great daughter they were about to interview. He was trying to be supportive, but his condition made everything he said sound slurred and inappropriate. The receptionist came over to see what was happening, and I had to explain that the intoxicated man was my father. Her expression immediately changed from professional curiosity to barely concealed concern. I could see her making mental notes about the situation. By this point, other employees had gathered to watch the spectacle. My dad was becoming more belligerent with security and started making threats about what would happen if they didn't treat his daughter with respect. The whole situation was spiraling completely out of control. The hiring manager I was supposed to meet with appeared in the lobby, drawn by the noise. She took one look at the scene, my drunk father arguing with security, while I stood there red-faced and apologetic, and I knew my chances were over. Security eventually escorted my dad out of the building, but not before he'd shouted several more embarrassing proclamations about my qualifications and how lucky the company would be to hire me. The entire lobby had witnessed the most unprofessional scene imaginable. The receptionist approached me with a sympathetic expression and explained that they'd need to reschedule my interview for another time. She said they understood this wasn't my fault, but that the disruption had made it impossible to proceed with today's meeting. I knew they were just being polite. No company wants to hire someone whose family creates public disturbances in their lobby. The hiring manager had seen enough to make a judgment about what kind of problems I might bring to their workplace. I called my dad later that day to confront him about what he'd done. He was sobered up by then, but seemed confused about why I was upset. He claimed he'd just wanted to show support for my big opportunity and didn't understand how his presence could have been harmful. My dad insisted that any employer worth working for would appreciate a father who cared enough to show up for his daughter's interview. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the idea that his intoxicated state had been inappropriate or damaging to my prospects. 2 days later, I received a polite rejection email from the consulting firm. They thanked me for my interest, but said they decided to move forward with other candidates. No mention was made of the lobby incident, but I knew that was the real reason. The worst part was that this had been my dream job, exactly the kind of position I'd spent 4 years preparing for in college. One afternoon of my father's poor judgment had potentially derailed months of careful career planning and job searching. I've since found employment elsewhere, but it took several more months of interviews and applications. Every time I walked into a new office lobby, I worried that somehow my dad might show up and create another scene. The experience taught me that I need to be much more careful about sharing personal information with my father, especially when alcohol might be involved. His intentions were good, but his judgment while drinking is completely unreliable. Well, that's a wrap on another collection of stories that prove the internet never runs out of wild family drama and relationship chaos. From wedding dress hijackers to secret tunnel builders, tonight's tales reminded us that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones happening right next door. Whether these helped you drift off or kept you wide awake wondering about your own relatives, thanks for hanging out with me through all the madness. Sleep well, and remember, at least your family probably isn't selling your stuff on eBay or building underground passages into your yard. Probably.